Welcome to Calm Science Sleep, where quiet curiosity meets deep sleep. What if the last thing you ever experienced was also the most beautiful? People have returned from the edge of death describing tunnels of light, the sensation of floating above their own bodies, encounters with loved ones long gone, and a warmth so complete it erased every fear they had ever carried. For centuries, these accounts were dismissed as hallucinations, as wishful thinking, as the desperate imaginings of a dying mind. But in recent decades, something unexpected has happened. Scientists began to take them seriously. Tonight, we are going to move gently through the science of near-death experiences, what the brain does in its final moments, what researchers have found when they actually looked, and what the most honest answer to that strange and enormous question might be. Not because it will keep you awake with dread, but because there is something surprisingly peaceful waiting on the other side of the question. Something that a careful examination of the evidence tends to leave you with. Not terror, but quiet wonder. So settle in, breathe slowly, and let the day drift a little further behind you as we begin. The first thing worth knowing is that near-death experiences are not rare. Studies suggest that somewhere between 10 and 20% of people who survive cardiac arrest report some kind of experience during the period when their heart had stopped and their brain showed no measurable activity. If you scale that up across the population of people who have survived clinical death and been resuscitated, the number of people who have reported these experiences runs into the millions. Millions of ordinary people, not mystics or poets, but nurses and accountants and farmers and teachers, all describing something that felt more real than ordinary waking life. That is the first puzzle. Hallucinations typically feel less real than waking experience. Dreams are usually recognized as strange, even while they are happening, in the way that ordinary perception is not. But people who have had near-death experiences almost universally report the opposite. They describe a clarity, a vividness, a sense of reality that they say exceeded anything they had known before. One cardiologist who spent decades studying these accounts described his patients as the most credible witnesses he had ever encountered, not because they were strange, but because they were so consistently ordinary in every other way, and yet so consistently shaken by what they had seen. That consistency is the second puzzle. Across cultures, across centuries, across wildly different personal beliefs, the core features of near-death experiences appear again and again with a regularity that is genuinely difficult to explain away as simple coincidence. So what are those features? What do people actually describe? The most commonly reported element is a profound sense of peace, often arriving very suddenly, as if a switch were flipped. People who had been in tremendous pain or panic before losing consciousness describe the pain vanishing entirely, replaced by a deep, still calm, unlike anything they had felt in ordinary life. Not numbness, not blankness, but something warm and deliberate, as though the universe had quietly decided that they had carried enough weight and had lifted it from them. Following the peace, many people describe a sense of separation from the physical body, the sensation of looking down at themselves from above, of watching doctors or paramedics work on them from a corner of the ceiling. This is what researchers call an out-of-body experience, and it sits at the center of some of the most extraordinary scientific debates about consciousness and the brain. Raymond Moody, the psychiatrist who first brought these experiences into popular awareness with his 1975 book, Life After Life, collected hundreds of accounts from people who had been resuscitated after clinical death. He noticed that many of them described in precise detail things they should not have been able to see, the specific actions of medical staff, the exact tools used, conversations that took place in rooms they were not physically in, details that were later verified. One of the most famous early cases involved a woman known in the literature simply as Maria, who reported floating out of her body during a cardiac arrest and drifting outside the hospital, where she observed a single tennis shoe sitting on a ledge above a third-story window. A shoe of a very specific style, with a worn spot near the little toe and a lace tucked under the heel. A social worker named Kimberly Clark Sharp went looking for the shoe and found it exactly as described, on a ledge that would have been invisible from anywhere inside the hospital or from the ground below. Cases like this are not easily explained, and they are not unique. Over the following decades, researchers began deliberately designing studies around exactly this kind of verification. They placed cards or objects in high places inside hospital rooms, objects that would only be visible from above, and they waited to see if patients who reported out-of-body experiences during resuscitation could describe them. The results were tantalizing, if incomplete. Some patients described the objects accurately. Others reported being in the room, but not paying attention to anything other than what was happening to their body. The AWARE study, conducted by Dr. Sam Parnia at Southampton University and later extended at New York University, was perhaps the most rigorous attempt to test this. Parnia placed visual targets on high shelves in cardiac resuscitation rooms and recruited patients who reported any kind of experience during cardiac arrest. Most patients did not report experiences at all. Of those who did, only a small number reported the kind of visual detail that would have allowed verification. But one case, described in the published results, stood out. A patient described in accurate detail a specific sequence of events that occurred while he was clinically dead, including the sound of a specific piece of music that had been playing and the presence of a particular person in the room who should not have been there. His account was corroborated. This does not prove anything definitive. A single verified case, or even several, is not the same as a controlled experiment with clear conclusions, but it does suggest that something is happening that conventional neuroscience has not fully accounted for, and it is worth sitting with that discomfort for a moment, rather than rushing past it. Now, alongside the out-of-body experience, another feature appears in account after account: the tunnel. People describe a sense of movement through darkness, often described as a cylindrical or tunnel-shaped space, accompanied by a feeling of acceleration, of being drawn forward. At the end of the tunnel, or sometimes filling it entirely, there is light. Not a harsh or blinding light, but something warm and inviting. Something that people consistently describe as emanating love. Not love in the human sense of attachment and longing, but something more fundamental than that. As though love were not a feeling, but a substance, and you had been swimming in a thin version of it your entire life without realizing it. And this was the undiluted form. What causes the tunnel? Several neurological explanations have been proposed. One of the most cited is the hypoxia hypothesis, the idea that as oxygen levels in the brain fall, the visual cortex begins to fire spontaneously, and because the neurons responsible for peripheral vision are more densely packed and more vulnerable to oxygen deprivation, they go dark first, creating the impression of a narrowing visual field, a closing circle, a tunnel. This is a reasonable explanation, as far as it goes. When fighter pilots are subjected to high acceleration forces that push blood away from their head, they sometimes report a narrowing of vision and a brief brightening in the center before consciousness is lost. Recreational users of certain anesthetic drugs, particularly ketamine, report tunnel-like visual experiences. And nitrous oxide, when administered in high concentrations, can produce feelings of rushing movement and bright light. But the hypoxia hypothesis has some significant problems. One of them is that near-death experiences have been reported by people who were not technically hypoxic, people whose oxygen levels remained stable throughout a medical crisis. Another is that the experience often does not behave like what we know hallucinations to look like. Hallucinations tend to be idiosyncratic, personal, shaped by the individual's specific memories and anxieties and cultural expectations. Near-death experiences, despite crossing every cultural boundary, retain a recognizable core that is genuinely puzzling if they are purely the product of individual brain chemistry. Dr. Pim van Lommel, a Dutch cardiologist who conducted one of the largest prospective studies of near-death experiences in 2001, published in the Lancet, found that not all cardiac arrest patients who were resuscitated reported experiences. In fact, only about 18% did. If oxygen deprivation were the sole cause, you would expect everyone who survived cardiac arrest to report similar experiences, since they would all have undergone the same physiological process. The fact that some people report vivid, structured experiences and others report nothing at all suggests that something more specific is happening, something not yet fully explained by brain chemistry alone. Van Lommel's study also found something remarkable about the timing of reported experiences. People described events occurring during the period when their hearts had stopped and their brain waves had flatlined. During this period, the brain is producing no detectable electrical activity. The EEG is flat. Under current neurological understanding, this is precisely when the brain should be least capable of producing coherent, structured experiences. And yet the experiences described are not fragmentary or chaotic. They are often unusually clear, organized, and emotionally resonant. This brings us to one of the most contested ideas in consciousness research: the question of whether the brain produces consciousness, the way a television set produces a picture, or whether the brain receives and translates consciousness, the way a television set receives a signal from outside itself. Most neuroscientists work within the first framework. Consciousness is what the brain does. When the brain stops, consciousness stops. Near-death experiences, in this view, are products of a dying brain. Perhaps beautiful products, perhaps deeply meaningful ones, but ultimately the last flicker of a biological machine powering down. But a small and growing number of researchers are genuinely uncertain about this. They are not necessarily claiming that consciousness survives death. They are making a more modest and perhaps more interesting point: that the evidence from near-death experiences is not neatly compatible with the standard model, and that this should prompt more careful investigation rather than dismissal. The philosopher and consciousness researcher David Chalmers famously described what he called the hard problem of consciousness, the fact that even a complete description of the brain's physical processes does not, even in principle, explain why there should be any subjective experience at all, why there is something it is like to be you, why the processing of information feels like anything rather than simply occurring in the dark. Near-death experiences sit right at the center of that unsolved problem. And here, as the brain slows and the body stills, let your own thoughts soften for a moment. You do not need to resolve this question tonight. The question itself is enough. Just let it rest gently at the edges of your awareness, like a light seen through glass, present but not pressing. Among all the features of the near-death experience, Perhaps none is described with more emotional intensity than the encounter with other beings. Most people who have these experiences describe meeting someone or several someones during the experience. Often these are deceased relatives, a grandmother, a parent, a childhood friend. Sometimes they are figures of light or presence who have no obvious identity, but are nonetheless experienced as deeply familiar, deeply benevolent. What is striking is not simply that people meet these figures, but how they describe the meeting. People report being recognized, not just seen, but known, in a way that no ordinary human encounter quite achieves. Loved completely and without condition, without the complicated texture of ordinary human relationships, with their histories of misunderstanding and disappointment. Accepted in a way that feels, by many accounts, like coming home after an absence so long you had almost forgotten what home felt like. And then, frequently, they are told it is not time, or they feel a pull back toward the body, toward the life they had been living, and they return. The return is described as one of the hardest parts. Dr. Kenneth Ring, a psychologist who spent much of his career studying near-death experiences, documented this pattern extensively. The return to ordinary consciousness, to pain, to the weight of physical existence, often felt to people like falling back into a much smaller and less vivid reality. Many survivors described a period of difficulty reintegrating, of feeling that the world they returned to was dimmer and less real than what they had briefly encountered. Some described grief at having come back. This is one of the most counterintuitive findings in the field. If near-death experiences were simple wish fulfillment, you might expect survivors to return grateful and relieved. Many do, eventually. But the initial experience is often quite the opposite. A sense of loss, of having been briefly somewhere that was more home than home, and then been returned to somewhere lesser. This changes people. That is perhaps the most consistent and well-documented finding in the entire literature. Near-death experiences have a transformative effect that is measurable, lasting, and qualitatively different from what you would expect if the experience were simply a hallucination or a vivid dream. Kenneth Ring and others found that people who had near-death experiences showed significant and lasting changes in personality and values. They became less fearful of death. They became more concerned with the well-being of others. They placed less emphasis on material success and more on love and human connection. They reported increased feelings of spirituality, not necessarily religiosity in a formal sense, but a deep sense of the sacredness of life. They showed greater empathy, greater compassion, a diminished ego. And these changes were not temporary. They persisted for years and decades, confirmed not only by the experiencers themselves, but by family members and close friends. Compare this to what we know about hallucinations. Hallucinations do not typically produce lasting personality transformation. A vivid dream, however beautiful, does not usually reorient someone's entire value system for the rest of their life. The depth and permanence of the changes following near-death experiences suggest that something significant occurred, regardless of what that something was. One particularly striking pattern is the reduction in fear of death that follows these experiences. Psychologists have long documented the pervasive role that fear of death plays in human psychology. Terror management theory suggests that much of human behavior, including our need for meaning, our attachment to belief systems, our pursuit of legacy, is shaped by the awareness of our own mortality and the anxiety that awareness creates. Near-death experiences appear to dissolve that anxiety in a way that years of therapy or spiritual practice rarely achieve. People who have been to the edge and looked over consistently report that what they saw did not look like extinction. Now there is a voice in the room that wants to interject here, and it is a reasonable voice. It says that perhaps these experiences feel meaningful and real precisely because the dying brain floods itself with neurochemicals designed to ease the transition. That the warmth, the love, the sense of presence, the feeling of recognition might be the brain's gift to itself in the moment of crisis, a kindness built into the architecture of consciousness, designed not to tell the truth, but to make the ending bearable. This is a serious hypothesis, and it deserves serious consideration. Rick Strassman, a psychiatrist and researcher, proposed in his 2001 book that the pineal gland, a small structure deep in the brain, might release large quantities of dimethyltryptamine, a naturally occurring psychedelic compound, at the moment of death. DMT produces experiences that overlap significantly with those described in near-death accounts, including encounters with entities, feelings of unconditional love, a sense of traversing some kind of threshold between realities. Strassman's hypothesis is speculative, and the evidence for it remains incomplete, but it has attracted serious attention. Similarly, the role of endorphins has been proposed. In moments of extreme stress, the brain releases large quantities of endogenous opioids, which produce feelings of euphoria and reduce pain. The peace and absence of distress described in the early phases of near-death experiences could plausibly be explained by this mechanism. And yet there are problems with purely neurochemical explanations. They tend to explain the emotional quality of the experience without addressing the structural content. They explain why someone might feel peaceful, but not why they might accurately describe a shoe on a window ledge. They explain why the experience might feel deeply meaningful, but not why it would consistently and specifically involve deceased relatives, rather than any random assemblage of meaningful figures from a person's life. They also do not explain what happens in cases of congenitally blind individuals, people who have been blind since birth, who have never had any visual experience of the world, sometimes report visual elements during near-death experiences. They describe colors, faces, landscapes, things they should have no internal representation of whatsoever. This is one of the most challenging findings in the literature. Kenneth Ring and Sharon Cooper conducted an extensive study of blind individuals who had near-death experiences and found that a significant proportion reported visual content, in some cases verified afterward by sighted witnesses. If near-death experiences were simply the brain generating imagery from stored memories and sensory history, the blind should have experiences with no visual component at all. Some do. The experiences of the congenitally blind tend to differ, but many report something that they can only describe as visual, even lacking any prior framework for understanding what vision is. There is another angle worth considering here, and it comes not from the research into dying, but from the research into the moments just before birth. Children who are old enough to have clear and detailed memories sometimes describe what researchers loosely call pre-birth memories, experiences of existing before they were born. This is a far less rigorously studied area, and it is worth holding more lightly. But what is interesting is that some children's descriptions of pre-birth states share striking similarities with the near-death accounts of adults. A sense of peace, a sense of presence, a sense of choosing to come into life. If the near-death experience is a glimpse of what lies beyond death, and if pre-birth accounts share its qualities, then perhaps what we are glimpsing is not merely an end point, but something continuous, something that both precedes and follows the brief window of embodied existence. Let your breathing slow a little more. The thinking part of this journey is beginning to soften into something quieter. What remains is not argument, but impression, not conclusion, but feeling. Let us talk for a moment about the life review. Many people who have had near-death experiences describe a phenomenon that researchers call the panoramic life review, a replay of their entire life or large portions of it, experienced not sequentially, but simultaneously, as if all of it were present at once. What is most remarkable about this is not the breadth of the review, but its quality. People do not simply watch their lives like a film. They re-experience it from multiple perspectives, including the perspectives of other people involved. A moment of cruelty is re-experienced as if you were the person on the receiving end. A moment of kindness is re-experienced as if you were the person who was helped. This gives the life review an ethical dimension that is almost unbearably precise. It is not a judgment delivered by an external force. It is understanding delivered directly. People who have undergone the life review often describe it not as punishment or accusation, but as illumination. They understand clearly and without defense the effect their actions had on others. They see the ripples. They feel them. This is transformative in a particular way. People who have had a life review tend to come back with what one researcher described as a radically altered moral compass, not in the sense of adopting a new set of rules, but in the sense of having genuinely understood, at the level of lived experience rather than intellectual principle, why love and kindness matter. The golden rule, love your neighbor as yourself, is reframed by the life review not as a moral command, but as a literal description of reality. In the life review, you are your neighbor. The self and the other collapse into the same experience. One man who described his life review said that he re-experienced a day from his childhood when he had casually made fun of a smaller boy in front of others. He had not thought about this in 50 years. It had not seemed significant, but in the review, he felt what that boy had felt, the hot flush of shame, the loneliness, the way the moment had lodged in him and altered his relationship with trust. The man wept when he described it, decades later, not from guilt, but from understanding. And he said that of everything he encountered in his near-death experience, this was the part that changed him most. The life review appears in accounts from ancient Egypt, from medieval Christian literature, from Hindu sacred texts. The Tibetan Book of the Dead, a guide for the dying written over 1,000 years ago, describes a process of reviewing one's life that resembles the accounts of modern near-death experiencers with uncomfortable precision. Whether you take this as evidence of a common transcultural truth or as evidence that these narratives are culturally transmitted, the convergence itself is extraordinary. Now let us spend some time with the most carefully documented and scientifically controlled cases in the literature, because they represent something genuinely challenging to any explanation that does not take the phenomenon seriously. In 2014, a team of researchers led by Dr. Sam Parnia published results from the AWARE study in the journal Resuscitation. It was the largest study of its kind ever conducted. Over 4 years, they monitored more than 2,000 cardiac arrest patients across 15 hospitals in the United Kingdom, the United States, and Austria. Of those who survived, 140 were able to be interviewed. Of those, 55% reported some kind of perception during resuscitation. 2% of those cases met the criteria for a full near-death experience. And one case, the most widely discussed, involved a patient who accurately described in detail the specific sequence of events in the resuscitation room, including the position of equipment, the behavior of staff members, and sounds that occurred during a period when his brain showed no signs of functioning. Parnia was careful in his conclusions. He did not claim proof of life after death. He said simply that something happened in that case that current science could not fully explain, and that more careful study was warranted. That is perhaps the most honest thing a scientist can say. Around the same time, a series of studies began appearing in the field of consciousness research that were not about near-death experiences specifically, but that had significant implications for how we think about them. These were studies suggesting that the relationship between consciousness and the physical brain is more complicated than the simplest version of the standard model assumes. Anesthesia awareness cases, in which patients remain conscious during surgery, despite being in a state of drug-induced unconsciousness that should preclude any awareness, began to accumulate in the literature. Patients described accurate details of their operations, conversations between surgeons, even the emotional atmosphere in the room, from a state in which consciousness should have been completely suppressed. These cases do not involve near death, but they suggest that consciousness can persist in states where the brain appears to be offline in ways we do not fully understand. There is also the phenomenon of terminal lucidity, which is one of the most quietly astonishing findings in the entire field, and which most people have never heard of. Terminal lucidity refers to the unexpected recovery of mental clarity and coherence in the days or hours before death in patients who have been severely cognitively impaired, sometimes for years. Patients with advanced Alzheimer's disease, patients who have been in persistent vegetative states, patients with severe dementia who have not recognized their family members in years, sometimes experience a sudden return of full consciousness in the period immediately before death. They speak clearly, recognize loved ones, have coherent conversations, and then die. This is not a new observation. It appears in medical literature going back centuries. Alexander Bathiani at the University of Vienna has been systematically documenting these cases, and he has found that they occur with surprising frequency across a wide range of neurological conditions. In 2009, he published a review in which he estimated that as many as 10% of patients with severe dementia experience some form of terminal lucidity before death. The significance of this for near-death experience research is profound. If consciousness can flourish in the moments before death, even in a brain that has been severely damaged for years, the assumption that consciousness depends entirely and straightforwardly on the physical condition of the brain becomes very difficult to maintain. The dying brain, rather than producing less experience, sometimes produces more, clearer, more coherent experience than the living damaged brain. Michael Nahm, a German biologist who has written extensively about terminal lucidity, described a case from 1922 in which a woman with severe mental illness who had been hospitalized for over 50 years and who had not spoken coherently in decades sat up several days before her death and delivered a clear, lucid account of her life, expressed love for those around her, and sang a hymn. She died peacefully shortly after. Her doctors, who had cared for her for years, were astonished. Cases like this do not fit neatly into our current understanding of how the brain produces consciousness. They sit in the literature like quiet questions that have not yet been answered. Breathe slowly. You are in the part of the night where the mind is already beginning to soften its hold on the day. The ideas are still here, but they are gentling. They are becoming less like arguments and more like impressions, less like things to be solved and more like things to be held. Let us talk about what people say the experience means to them afterward. not the content, but the significance, what people carry back with them into ordinary life. The overwhelming consensus across thousands of accounts collected over decades is that the experience communicated something specific, not a theological doctrine, not a set of rules or commandments, something simpler and more difficult to argue with. That love is the most fundamental thing, not in a vague or sentimental sense. People describe returning from the edge of death with the absolute conviction, not the hope or the belief, but the direct experiential knowledge that love is somehow the substance of reality, that it is not a human invention or a biological strategy or a comforting story, that it is what everything is made of, the way that matter is made of atoms, except more fundamental than that. This convergence is striking. Across different cultural contexts, different religious backgrounds, different ages and personalities and circumstances, the deepest takeaway is consistently the same. Love is real. It is not just an emotion. It is something closer to the nature of existence itself. Carl Jung, who had his own profound near-death experience following a heart attack in 1944, described what he encountered as a sense of the universe resting in profound bliss and peace. He wrote afterward that the experience made the world seem remote and unimportant, and yet also more precious than it had ever seemed before, precisely because it was temporary. He described it as having met something that he recognized immediately as more real than ordinary waking life. Jung spent the remainder of his career trying, in his characteristically complex and indirect way, to describe what he had understood in that encounter. He returned from it convinced that the psyche, or some aspect of it, was not contained within the body in the way that most of us assume. There is a particular quality to the accounts of people who have returned from the edge of death, and it is this: they do not argue with you. They do not insist. They simply describe what happened to them with a clarity and a certainty that comes not from intellectual conviction, but from direct experience. And they tend to have a kind of patience with the impossibility of conveying it fully, as if they understand that what they are pointing to cannot be transmitted through language, only approximated, the way a painting of the ocean can gesture at the ocean, but cannot contain it. One woman who survived a near-death experience during childbirth described returning to her body as re-entering a very heavy coat. Not an unpleasant coat, she said, just much heavier than she remembered it being. She said she understood for the first time that she had been wearing that coat her entire life and had simply forgotten that it was a coat, that there was something lighter underneath. Let the image rest for a moment. The heavy coat. The thing that was always there underneath. There is a related body of research that does not involve near death at all, but which intersects with these questions in interesting ways. It is the growing literature on end-of-life experiences, sometimes called deathbed visions, in which people in the final days or hours of life report vivid encounters with deceased loved ones or with presences of light. These are distinct from near-death experiences in an important way. Near-death experiences occur when someone has been clinically dead and is resuscitated. End-of-life experiences occur when someone is actively dying and has not yet crossed any medical threshold. They are reported to hospice workers, palliative care nurses, and family members with remarkable frequency. Dr. Christopher Kerr, a palliative care physician in Buffalo, New York, spent years systematically documenting these experiences in dying patients and published his findings in a book and multiple peer-reviewed papers. He found that the majority of dying patients, when asked, reported vivid and meaningful dreams or visions in the weeks before death. These visions overwhelmingly featured deceased loved ones, often people who had died years or decades earlier. And the effect of these visions on the dying person was almost uniformly comforting. Patients who were frightened and in distress became calm. Patients who had been anxious about dying reported that the visions had removed their fear. Patients who had been estranged from deceased family members reported reconciliation and forgiveness within the visions. What is particularly notable in Kerr's work is that the dying patients did not experience these visions as hallucinations. They did not describe them as dreamlike or unclear. They described them as distinct from dreams, as more real, as meaningful in a way that ordinary dreaming was not. And many of them reported that the experiences changed their relationship to their own dying, making it not a thing to be endured, but something they began, tentatively, to look forward to. Kerr himself is a physician and an empiricist. He is careful not to make claims beyond what his data supports, but he is equally careful not to dismiss what his patients report. He has said that after years of sitting with dying people and listening to their experiences, he finds the conventional assumption that these visions are simply the product of a deteriorating brain deeply unsatisfying. The visions are too coherent, too consistently meaningful, too transformative in their effects on the dying person to be adequately explained by neural noise. This brings us to a broader question that underlies all of this research, and it is perhaps the most honest question to ask. What are we afraid of finding? Science, like all human endeavors, is not entirely immune to the influence of fear. The possibility that consciousness might not be entirely contained within the physical brain, that something might persist beyond death, is deeply threatening to a worldview that has taken centuries to construct and that has served humanity well in many ways. The secular, materialist worldview has given us medicine and technology and the scientific method itself. It is not something to be discarded lightly. And yet a worldview is not a religion. Its value comes from its accuracy, from its ability to account for what we actually observe. And if what we observe consistently includes a phenomenon that the worldview cannot easily accommodate, intellectual honesty requires that we hold the worldview a little less tightly. There are serious scientists, not fringe figures, but respected researchers with impeccable credentials who believe that the evidence from near-death experiences, combined with the hard problem of consciousness, combined with the findings from terminal lucidity and deathbed visions and end-of-life experiences, constitutes a genuine challenge to the most reductive versions of materialism. They are not claiming certainty. They are not asking for a leap of faith. They are simply saying that the question is genuinely open and that it deserves more rigorous attention than it has historically received. And there is something quietly liberating in that, in acknowledging that we do not know, that the universe may be larger and stranger and kinder than our current models suggest, that the evidence, while not conclusive, does not point toward the cold and empty ending that so many people fear. Let your breath slow a little further. The room is quiet. The night is settling around you. There are a few more things worth knowing before this journey gentles into sleep. One of them concerns the effects of near-death experiences on those who have them, specifically the changes in fear. Multiple studies, including large quantitative surveys conducted by Ring, by Van Lommel, by Bruce Greyson at the University of Virginia, who has spent more than 4 decades collecting and analyzing near-death experience accounts, have found that fear of death is dramatically and lastingly reduced following a near-death experience. not just somewhat reduced. Dramatically. People who had feared death intensely throughout their lives, who had structured significant portions of their behavior around that fear, without necessarily being aware of it, describe a near complete dissolution of that fear following the experience. Greyson, who developed what is now known as the Greyson Near-Death Experience Scale, a standardized instrument for measuring the depth and nature of these experiences, found in his research that the reduction in death anxiety was one of the most consistent outcomes he observed. He also found that people who had not had a near-death experience themselves, but who had been deeply immersed in the accounts of others, who had spent years reading and listening to these experiences, also showed meaningful reductions in death anxiety, as if the stories themselves carried something, not just information, but something more like reassurance. This is a gentle finding. It suggests that even for those of us who have not had our own encounter with the edge, engaging seriously and openly with this material may itself be a form of preparation. A softening of the armoring that fear of death requires us to maintain. There is also a curious dimension to near-death experiences that does not receive as much attention, but that researchers like Greyson have documented carefully. The effect on those around the experiencer. Spouses and close family members of people who have had near-death experiences often report their own significant changes, a reduced fear of death, a deepened sense of meaning, an expanded sense of what is possible. The experience seems to travel, not just in the obvious sense of being communicated through story, but in some harder to quantify way, as if the experiencer brings something back with them that is perceptible in their presence, even without explicit description. One hospice chaplain described it this way. She said that she could almost always tell, when meeting someone for the first time, whether they had had a near-death experience, not because of anything they said, but because of something in the quality of their presence. A stillness, she said, a kind of groundedness that she could only describe as someone who knows something the rest of us are still working out. That kind of knowing is not scientific data. It is the kind of observation that resists quantification, but it points at something that the quantitative research also seems to point at, which is that whatever these experiences are, they leave a mark. They leave something behind that is real and lasting, and that the people who have them consistently describe as the most important thing that has ever happened to them. The most important thing. Not the most dramatic, not the most disturbing. The most important. People describe coming back and looking at the world with a tenderness they had not previously had access to. Looking at strangers and feeling, for perhaps the first time, that they genuinely love them. Not in the way you love someone you know, but in the way that you might love the sky. A love that asks nothing and has no particular object, and yet is completely real. Looking at objects and feeling grateful for their existence. Looking at time itself differently, as something less like a countdown and more like a gift. Looking at other people's suffering and finding they can no longer maintain a comfortable distance from it. These are the changes. These are the things people carry back with them from the edge. And whether you understand them as evidence of a genuine encounter with something beyond ordinary existence, or as the deeply meaningful product of a mind briefly freed from its usual constraints, the changes are real. The love they describe is real. The reduced fear is real. The deeper engagement with the preciousness of life is real. There is something in that convergence that is worth resting in for a moment. Think about what it would mean to move through your life with a little less fear of the ending. To feel, not just intellectually, but in some way more direct than that. that whatever lies at the far end of this particular journey is not terrible, that it might be, in the way that a homecoming is, something you have been moving toward your entire life without knowing it, that the love you have been reaching toward in every relationship, in every moment of beauty you have paused to let in, might be less like an isolated human invention and more like a memory of something you once knew. That is what the people who have been there say, overwhelmingly, in account after account after account. They say that love is real in a way they had not understood before, and they say that whatever awaits us, it is not what we feared. William James, the great American psychologist and philosopher of the late 19th and early 20th century, spent much of his later career investigating what he called the varieties of religious experience, including mystical states and encounters with other dimensions of consciousness. He was rigorous, skeptical, and deeply empirical. He also came to believe, through the weight of evidence accumulated across thousands of accounts, that consciousness was not simply a product of the brain in the same way that bile is a product of the liver. He proposed what he called the transmission theory of consciousness, the idea that the brain might function as a filter or reducing valve for a broader field of consciousness, much as a prism filters white light into the visible spectrum. On this view, the death of the brain would not end consciousness, but simply remove the filter, allowing the underlying awareness to return to something larger. This is not a proven theory. It is a hypothesis, but it is a hypothesis proposed by one of the most rigorous minds in the history of psychology, based on a genuine engagement with evidence that he found compelling, and it has the virtue of accommodating both the hard problem of consciousness and the accumulated findings of near-death experience research more elegantly than the alternative. The alternative, the view that consciousness is simply and entirely a product of neural activity, has the virtue of parsimony, of simplicity, of fitting within a framework that has served science very well. But it faces a genuine difficulty in explaining why there should be any subjective experience at all. Why all of this information processing feels like something from the inside, and it faces additional difficulty in explaining the specific content of near-death experiences, particularly the verified out-of-body perceptions and the experiences of the congenitally blind. Neither view is proven. Both are held by serious people. And that is perhaps the most accurate and honest thing to say. As you move toward sleep now, let the questions rest. You do not need to resolve them tonight. The universe has been carrying them for rather longer than you have been around, and it is not expecting you to come up with the answer before morning. What matters more than the answer is perhaps the quality of attention you bring to the question, the willingness to hold it openly, without forcing it into a shape it does not naturally fit. That openness is itself a kind of practice. It is what researchers call epistemic humility, and it is one of the most valuable qualities a mind can cultivate. It means remaining genuinely curious rather than defensively certain. It means being willing to be surprised. It means holding your working assumptions about the nature of reality just lightly enough that new evidence can move them. And the evidence from near-death research, imperfect and incomplete as it is, does seem to be pointing at something. It is pointing at the possibility that consciousness is more robust than we thought, that the mind is more than the brain, or at least that the relationship between them is more complex than the simplest models suggest, that the experience of dying, which so many of us have been conditioned to think of as the ultimate horror, may in fact bear more resemblance to the accounts that keep coming back from its edges: warmth, love, recognition, light. The people who have been there say the same thing again and again. It was not what I expected. It was better than anything I could have imagined, and coming back was the hard part. Let that rest with you now, not as a belief you are being asked to adopt, but as a possibility you are invited to sit with, a gentle opening in the fabric of what you thought you knew. The night is quiet. Your body is settling. The breath is slowing into the long rhythm of deep rest. Whatever you believe about what lies beyond the edge of this life, the people who have glimpsed it tend to agree on one thing. The way to live well in the time you have is not complicated. It is simple almost to the point of being embarrassing. Love the people around you. Be kind. Pay attention to what is actually happening rather than to your anxious projections about what might happen. Be present. Be gentle. The life review will come for all of us eventually, in whatever form it takes. The accounts suggest it is worth living in a way you will be comfortable to revisit. And perhaps that is the most practical thing this entire field of research has to offer. Not certainty about what lies beyond death, but clarity about how to live on this side of it. Science has carried us far into the mystery tonight, farther than we usually allow ourselves to go. And at the edge of what science can say with confidence, there is something that sits quietly and waits, something that the people who have been closest to it consistently describe as more welcoming than terrifying, more luminous than dark, more like love than like anything else they have words for. The stars are quiet outside. The night is doing what it always does, holding everything gently in its darkness, making room for rest. Sleep well, dream freely, and if you wake with the sense that the world is a little more extraordinary than you remembered, that is perhaps the smallest version of what the people at the edge of death return carrying. If this journey into the science of what lies beyond has offered you something tonight, something to think about, something to hold more gently, it would mean a great deal if you gave this video a quiet like before you drift off, or subscribe to the channel so the next exploration finds you when you need it. The comments below are a warm place too, if you want to share where in the world you are listening from and what time it is in your corner of the night. Until the next journey, sleep well. The universe is larger and kinder than it looks from here. Good night.